Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're going to be talking about whether Todd Gurley is still the #1 overall pick going into the 2019 fantasy football season. It's safe to say that the Rams and Todd Gurley both struggled in the playoffs mightily. Even though they were able to get to the Super Bowl, both Todd Gurley and the Rams offensively did not look as polished as they did earlier on in the season, and I think a lot of that has to do with a couple factors that we're going to be going over today. And before we begin, I just want to say I'm ready to start the 2019 season. I've been gone for a little while, but we're going to get right back into it. So let's get right into this. Let's talk about whether Todd Gurley is still the #1 overall pick. Hey everybody, how's it going? All right, so before we begin, I just want to remind you guys, whether you're new, I've been here since day one. My Twitter handle is down below. If you want to ask me any questions, you can follow me there. If you haven't already, click that subscribe button. And right next to the subscribe button, whether you've been here again since day one or you just newly subscribed, that little bell button will notify you whenever I bring out any new content or videos. So go ahead and keep yourself updated that way. But again, we're going to be talking about Todd Gurley. And the arguments have been going around whether he is still the #1 overall pick consensus around the National Football League as we enter the 2019 fantasy football season. Why is that conversation coming up? Mainly because of the fact that he got injured late in the regular season, missed out on week 16 and 17, in which CJ Anderson really stepped up. And that offense, they looked just as good with or without Todd Gurley in the regular season. They got into the playoffs. And Todd Gurley, yes, he played well against the Cowboys, but against the Saints and the New England Patriots, he looked like a shell of himself. Whether that was due to the injury, whether that was due to having to split carries with another running back, which definitely could bother some running backs mentally. We're going to be going over that. I'm going to be looking at both sides of the argument. To begin, the main thing we want to remind ourselves is that Todd Gurley's a stud. Right, we all know that. Statistically, in 2017, he had his best statistical season, and fantasy-wise, he was an absolute monster. We know that in 2017, and to be honest, perhaps even in 2018, he's been the fantasy MVP. I understand that Patrick Mahomes came along and had something to say about that and really threw his name into the hat. But, talking about 2017, Todd Gurley was capable of, doing no wrong, to be honest. And statistically, he was a monster. In 2017, he put up stats like 1,305 rushing yards with 13 rushing touchdowns, 54 receptions for 788 receiving yards, 6 receiving touchdowns, and that all accumulated to, in half-point PPR scoring formats, 351.3 points, which in 2017 was the most points. So we came into the 2018 season believing, Todd Gurley is the #1A. He is the #1 consensus running back to be taken off of boards, and especially when Le'Veon Bell's situation started to arise, it was known by many that Todd Gurley should be the first one coming off the board, and he picked up right where he left off. Todd Gurley came into the 2018 season carrying his teams, and statistically, even having not played the last 2 games of the season, still had 1,251 rushing yards for 17 rushing touchdowns, 59 receptions, 580 receiving yards for 4 receiving touchdowns, and only had 9 less points than the year prior with 342.6 half-point PPR scoring points. So still was a monster, led all running backs with scoring, having not played in week 16 and 17 due to that knee injury that he sustained against the Philadelphia Eagles in week 15. And, we know that he's a stud. We're not here to just come here and praise him and talk about, oh my God, Todd Gurley's a monster. We're going to talk about some other things. We're going to talk about the other side of the coin. The argument that perhaps due to the acquisition of CJ Anderson and the amount that he was being used later on in the season and into the playoffs, that could potentially hurt Todd Gurley going into the 2019 season. And there are a lot of good other options that we could potentially talk about, perhaps going #1 this coming season. So we're going to get into that. So to begin, let's talk about the backfield of the Rams. Let's talk about the Rams before we talk about other potential picks. So let's talk about Gurley and Anderson. So is this potentially going to be a timeshare? That is the question that's on a lot of people's minds. A report came out last week that said the Rams, they're looking into re-signing CJ Anderson, bringing him back for another season in order to, bolster up this backfield. They believe that perhaps they've been giving too many carries to Todd Gurley over the last couple years, and that's really put a strain on his body. Therefore, they're thinking if we can keep C.J. Anderson, be able to take a little bit of the workload off of Todd Gurley, that could potentially keep him healthy and keep him all the way to the Super Bowl, so we don't have to repeat that scenario of where he's only touching the ball, 4 to 10 times a game for minimal yards. So is this going to be a timeshare? That's exactly the question on mind. C.J. Anderson, he came in week 16 and 17 of the regular season, and as I mentioned before, he picked up right where the Rams offense had left off. There was no hiccup replacing him for Todd Gurley. So the way I see it, yes, C.J. Anderson, he may not look like a running back. Yes, he may need to lose a couple pounds there. But to be honest, this guy's a monster. We saw it. We saw him perform. And statistically, he broke a couple records. In the first 3 games as a Los Angeles Ram, C.J. Anderson came out 66 carries for 422 rushing yards and 4 rushing touchdowns. That counts the game in week 16, 17, and the first game that they played in the playoffs against the Cowboys, in which he was just a monster. The record was that he was the first player in NFL history to go to a new team and have 3 consecutive 100-yard rushing games with 1 touchdown in each one of those games. So he really he picked up where the offense had left off, and there were really no hiccups transitioning to C.J. Anderson in the backfield, which kind of scares a lot of Gurley owners, which it kind of should, in my opinion. I think that, yes, C.J. Anderson, he's not a franchise guy. He's not as talented as Todd Gurley. But to be honest, statistically, he was putting up just as good as stats, playing just as good, if not better, than Todd Gurley in this back half of this season. And if we kind of dissect the amount of touches they were both getting in the playoffs when they were both on the field and somewhat healthy, which we'll go into later. In game 1, when they were both on the field at the same time, against the Cowboys, Todd Gurley, yes, he had majority of the snaps. He had played 57% of the offensive snaps compared to C.J. Anderson having only played 40% of the offensive snaps. Now, yes, that leans in the favor of Todd Gurley, yet Anderson had more carries, he had more yards, more rushing touchdowns, and he looked like the better running back. In game 2 of the playoffs, in the NFC Championship game against the Saints, Todd Gurley only played 46% of the offensive snaps, while good old bowling ball C.J. Anderson played 54%. They really, I don't know, I guess they didn't really trust that Todd Gurley was either healthy or was able to get the job done, which scares many of us. And in the Super Bowl, we all know, they only scored 3 points, and it was a rough game. C.J. Anderson had 7 carries for 22 yards. Todd Gurley, 10 carries for 35 yards. Neither of them were able to produce. But a guy like Gurley, he should be able to step up. If you're going to be the best player on this team, you're going to have to do a little bit more. Otherwise, yes, they're going to start handing the ball off to Anderson a little bit more, without a doubt. So as of right now, looking at it, if they go ahead and they re-sign C.J. Anderson, is that going to hurt Todd Gurley in the long run? I think health-wise, that's the only reason they are considering this, because to be honest, C.J. Anderson is just another guy that they picked up off the waivers. They don't have to pay him much, and they don't have to give him the ball much. But as long as it's an insurance policy on Todd Gurley, it could affect him fantasy-wise, but I'll go into stats in a little bit. In my opinion, that I don't think is going to hurt Todd Gurley too much. But then again, you never know. They may come out, hand the ball off, a couple goal line carries here or there. May steal a little bit of Todd Gurley's thunder. But in my opinion, I don't think it's going to hurt as bad as people may think. So let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about the other potential picks going into the 2019 NFL season. And we have a couple names. A couple studs, to be honest. We have Alvin Kamara, Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley, and Ezekiel Elliott. The next 4, studs at the running back position who really stepped up this past season. And the fact of the matter is, these are all young running backs. Zeke's out of all of these guys, Zeke is the oldest, having been in the league for only 3 seasons. Alvin Kamara and Christian McCaffrey, this past season was their sophomore year. And Saquon, as we all know, he was a rookie this past season, going into his second year now. these guys, the sky's the limit for these four. And that's why a lot of people are potentially thinking, hey, these guys can come up and steal that number one consensus running back spot away from Todd Gurley, and potentially, force Todd Gurley down the draft board, because if CJ Anderson's going to be in that backfield, it's going to hurt them. So let's talk about a couple of these guys. Specifically, let's begin with Alvin Kamara. I think Alvin Kamara is probably the least valued between the four sitting here because of the fact that Mark Ingram still exists. Now, Mark Ingram is on a contract year, which means he can either re-sign with the Saints or go ahead and move on and go with a different team. Now, that could potentially help Alvin Kamara's stock. We saw in the first 4 games of this past season in 2018, when Mark Ingram was suspended and wasn't on the field, Alvin Kamara touched the ball, at a premium. The guy was finding the end zone. He was just a fantasy monster, having games of 3+ touchdowns, touching the ball. There was a game in which he had 15 receptions against the Atlanta Falcons, if I'm not mistaken. Alvin Kamara is a stud. Whether he has Mark Ingram or not in that backfield, I think he's going to be a fantasy producer. But if Mark Ingram's not there, that even helps him that much more to be fantasy relevant. And we all know that. Alvin Kamara, yes, he's a stud. He's a monster. Had 18 touchdowns this past season. But if we can, let him loose and not have to, rein in his carries, not have to, hand the ball off to Mark Ingram every now and then in order to keep him fresh, we're going to see a lot of production out of Alvin Kamara. So I guess it's just contingent on whether or not Mark Ingram is going to get re-signed. If he does get re-signed, obviously I think Alvin Kamara is the least value between the 3 others on the screen. But if Mark Ingram's not there, I could see a lot of production out of Alvin Kamara in 2019. So let's talk about Christian McCaffrey, also in the NFC South. Christian McCaffrey came out and completely tore it up. At the beginning of the season, we thought, okay, CJ Anderson was on the Carolina Panthers in the beginning of the season. We thought to ourselves, maybe they're not going to give Christian McCaffrey the ball every single down because he's a smaller running back. He can barely handle taking that kind of a damage, and potentially he can get hurt. So they're going to use CJ Anderson to kind of spice it up here and there. And that was completely far from what was true. CJ Anderson was deemed useless, and they cut him. And Christian McCaffrey came out and had one of the most ridiculous fantasy seasons, NFL statistical seasons. He broke the record for most receptions for a running back in a single season. He broke Matt Forte's record. 107 receptions in a full point PPR. This guy was an absolute monster. Obviously, his touchdowns were a little bit on the lower side comparatively to guys like Alvin Kamara, Todd Gurley, or Saquon Barkley, but still, guy was a monster. Had 334 half-point PPR scoring points. And especially in the second half of the season, comparatively the first half, he was a monster. The other guys we want to talk about, Saquon Barkley, second to Todd Gurley in total points at the running back position, having 340.3. Coming into your rookie season, playing for not too great of a team. The offensive line, they tried to improve it with Nate Solder coming into left tackle, drafting guys in the first round of the NFL draft, like the left guard that they picked up, trying to kind of bolster up this offensive line to help Saquon Barkley. Still, they weren't great. But then again, this dude came out, 1307 rushing yards, 11 rushing touchdowns, 91 receptions. That is something that is extremely important to look at. He had more receptions than Alvin Kamara did. Can you believe that? I think it has a lot to do with the fact that Eli Manning is getting pressured, and the best way to Eli Manning to get the ball out of his hands, just dump it off to the running back out of the backfield. And Saquon Barkley was able to pick up yards and be productive with that. He's a guy that, as of right now, honestly, he might be the number 1 consensus running back over Todd Gurley because of the situation that's going down with Todd Gurley and CJ Anderson, whether that's going to be a timeshare, whether CJ Anderson is going to be taking away touches and potentially hurting his draft stock. The last guy I wanted to mention, Ezekiel Elliott, a guy that, just like Christian McCaffrey, came on strong in the second half of the season. In the beginning of the season, this offense was one-dimensional. All they wanted to do was hand the ball off to Zeke, and you really can't do that in the NFL, especially when defensive coordinators, they're going to cue in on that, and they're going to fill the box with 8 people. They're going to bring pressure, and they're going to prevent you from running the ball. That all being said, as soon as Amari Cooper came into town, this offense opened up, Dak was playing better, and Zeke had more opportunity to step up And they got Zeke more involved in that passing game, which is exactly what we wanted. Zeke's a guy that's going to touch the ball 400 plus times a season, and that's what we saw. And he was able to come out in that second half of the season and lead this team to the playoffs, in which, I mean, he had a fantastic second half. 1,400 rushing yards, as we see. Again, one of these guys that didn't have as many rushing touchdowns, which I'll go into in a little bit, why exactly that might be the case. But the main stat that really we need to focus in on is the fact that he was able to catch the ball 77 times for 567 yards, which we really didn't anticipate Zeke Elliott doing. I potentially saw him catching the ball max 50 times, but seeing more receptions, seeing more work out of the backfield, being more of a pivotal part of this offense, that's only, that's up arrows when it comes to fantasy. Those are just pluses. Those are bonuses. That's just the gravy on top. Anyway, so I wanted to basically kind of figure out what makes a top-tier running back. Why do we lean towards these guys? Obviously, they're great talents. They're on good offensive teams. And to be honest, they're touching the ball a lot. They're getting a lot of opportunity. And I always say this, opportunity leads to success in fantasy football. And I had to figure out what was the main source of success. What was determining these guys' success? And I kind of figured it out. I thought about, okay, is it the amount of rushing attempts? No, not really. Is it the amount of targets you get? Yeah, that kind of helps, but not great. Is it the amount of touches you get on first down, second down, third down? Potentially. Nothing really correlated and stepped up too big. But what I looked into and I found was that top-tier running backs, okay, Alvin Kamara, Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley, Ezekiel Elliott, and let's not forget, again, we're talking about Todd Gurley today. Those 5 guys, the difference between those 5 running backs and every other running back in the NFL is determined by the amount of red zone carries they get. So when you're in the red zone, if you touch the ball more than any other person in the NFL, chances are you're going to have a lot of fantasy points. Why? Because the biggest way to get fantasy points is getting touchdowns, getting those attempts in the red zone to end up, filling up that stat sheet. So what I looked into was how many red zone touches these potential 5 players got. And what I found was Christian McCaffrey, Alvin Kamara, Saquon Barkley, Ezekiel Elliott, and Todd Gurley, those 5 players were the top 5 leading running backs to touch the ball in the red zone in the 2018 season. So what exactly does that mean? Opportunity in the red zone, your team able to get down there and give you the ball, that leads to success 100%. And these 5 guys, who were the top 5 running backs in fantasy in 2018, led that stat. So to go into that, the top red zone touches for 2018 was tied between Todd Gurley and Alvin Kamara. Todd Gurley had 73 red zone touches, and Alvin Kamara had 73 red zone touches. Now, what exactly did that lead to? That led to Todd Gurley scoring 20 total touchdowns. 20 total touchdowns in the 73 touches that he had in the red zone. 20 touchdowns is a ridiculous amount. But if you're able to get to the red zone and you're getting the most red zone touches amongst all running backs, you're going to lead to success. Same thing with Alvin Kamara. Having touched the ball 73 times in the red zone, he had 16 total touchdowns. So 16 of his total 18 touchdowns came from the red zone because he was given that opportunity close to the goal line. Okay. The next highest was Saquon Barkley with 61 total touches in the red zone, led to 10 total touchdowns. And it's going in order. The next guy, Christian McCaffrey, yes, had less points, but still 60 total touches in the red zone, whether that be rushing or receiving. Excuse me. And he had 12 total touchdowns. Ezekiel Elliott, the guy with the least amount of red zone touches amongst the 5. And it kind of shows because he had the least amount of rushing touchdowns comparatively to these other guys. He only touched the ball 51 times in the red zone, and it only led to 7 total touchdowns. So 7 of his total 9 touchdowns came from the red zone. If this team was able to get to the red zone earlier on in the season, they were able to get down there, it would have led to more points. But just kind of correlating this stat, it's pretty ridiculous. So how do we get this back to Todd Gurley? The main thing that I saw was in the last 2 seasons, Todd Gurley has led the league in the amount of red zone touches amongst all players. He has 142 attempts. He has 142 total red zone touches in the last 2 seasons combined. And the ridiculous stat is that all 142 red zone touches have led to a total of 36 total touchdowns. That's ridiculous. Todd Gurley is finding himself the opportunity in the red zone, and he's scoring touchdowns, which is the difference. Whether it's Todd Gurley or Saquon Barkley or Ezekiel Elliott, Alvin Kamara, Christian McCaffrey, it's the difference between being that top running back and these guys. Yes, these guys are absolute studs. These guys are, second overall, third overall, fourth overall picks. But being able to touch the ball that many times in the red zone, being able to find the end zone 36 times because of the fact that you're given the opportunity down there. That's just a ridiculous stat. I mean, it's incredible. So before we get to the conclusion of whether or not Todd Gurley is the number one overall pick in fantasy going into the 2019 season, I had an opportunity to talk to Todd Gurley. I told many of you guys this past season that I have a direct line to Todd Gurley. We've talked multiple times on the phone, and I had an opportunity for him to call in and have an interview with him. So that's exactly what we're going to cut to right now before we get to the conclusion of this video. So without further ado, let's get into that. Again, this was a shorter interview. I understand Todd Gurley's a very busy man. So without further ado, let's get into that, shall we? Hello, Todd. Yes. Thank you again for calling, and much appreciated. Before we begin, I just want to go ahead. I want to congratulate you and the Rams organization for the amount of success you guys achieved this year. I understand you didn't get to the final goal in which you guys anticipated getting to in the 2018 season, but you guys should go into 2019 with your heads held high, and really be proud of the work you guys were able to do. Yeah, no, that's the mentality of a Super Bowl champion. I understand. Again, yeah, you guys weren't able to achieve that goal, but soon enough, you guys will be able to get there. So, before we get going, I have a couple questions at hand. I know you're a very busy man, so I'll get right into it. The topic that we're talking about today on the show is whether or not you're the number one overall pick in fantasy football. And to be honest, I think that you can potentially be up there for the amount of, utter success you've had in the last 2 seasons. I know you keep up to date with fantasy. We've seen you on Twitter multiple times saying, I'm doing my fantasy owners proud. And we, as a fantasy community, we love that. We love to see that. So my question is, how many pounds do you think C.J. Anderson has to lose to take your spot next season?
In the wrong direction on a one-way street. They'll probably get 20 years for this. Gotcha. Parking next to a fire hydrant in the no parking zone. In the wrong direction on a one-way street. They'll probably get 20 years for this. Sorry, dude, I saw it first. It's everyone to be
Yeah, understood. Okay. So, yeah, well, I mean, we understand. You are the number one running back of that backfield. And, C.J. Anderson is not going to take your spot. Yes, he had the opportunity because, you were down with an injury. But, yeah, I agree. You're probably going to come back this season and be fantastic. So, a couple of my other questions. Obviously, we didn't see you find much success against the Saints, against the New England Patriots. They were able to read your offense pretty well. Do you attribute some of that, deficiency of the offense either to a quarterback's, situation, or potentially is it the coach that's not giving you enough touches? Is that a potential on why perhaps you struggled not being able to get a rhythm?
In the wrong direction on a one-way street. They'll probably get 20 years for this. Gotcha. Parking next to a fire hydrant in no parking zone. In the wrong direction on a one-way street. They'll probably get 20 years for this.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. No, that makes sense. Like you mentioned, yeah, Cooper Kupp was a big part of that offense, and because of the fact that he wasn't there, Jared Goff, he just wasn't the same. Cooper Kupp, started off the regular season being one of the best, wide receivers in the league, much less one of the best fantasy football wide receivers, and him going down, yes, that I agree. It definitely hurt Jared Goff. It hurt the offense as a whole. It made the play calling a little bit difficult, which I understand. So I appreciate that. Let's move on. Let's talk about the other running backs. A couple of your constituents throughout the NFL, guys like Alvin Kamara, Ezekiel Elliott, Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley, 4 young, hungry studs that are getting after it in the NFL. These are guys that are trying to vie and take, the crown for being the number one overall pick in fantasy. How do you think, that'll go. Do you believe you are still the number one running back? You should be drafted number one overall, even though potentially C.J. Anderson is going to be in that backfield?
Down in the wrong direction on a one-way street. They'll probably get 20 years for it. Gotcha. Parking next to a fire hydrant and no parking zone in the wrong direction on a one-way street. They'll probably get 20 years for it. Sorry, dude, I saw it first. It's over on the detective team.
No, 100%, I agree. Yeah, I mean, everything points towards you have been the best running back. I agree. In the last 2 seasons, statistically, and your offense, putting up as many points per game as you guys do. You guys are one of the best offenses, and really, as long as they're feeding you the ball, yeah, you should be the number one running back, and I agree with that. So I know you're very busy, man. I only got one more question left as it pertains to the 2019 season. I know you're ready to get back to work, as you mentioned before. So the last questions I basically wanted to go over, Todd. Is there a potential that when I call you later on in the season, you're going to pick up and be able to give me that information? Because last season I called you in week 16 to know whether or not you were going to play. And what did you do, Todd? You ignored the phone call. But again, we're on the phone now, so all is well. We were able to instruct our fantasy owners to go pick up C.J. Anderson, which helped many of us win fantasy championships. So can you give me a verbal confirmation on whether or not you're going to be able to divulge a little bit of information coming this season?
Down in the wrong direction on a one-way street. They'll probably get 20 years for it.
Yes, that's much appreciated. Yeah.
No parking zone in the wrong direction on a one-way street. They'll probably get 20 years for it.
Yeah.
Sorry, dude, I saw it first. It's over on the detective team.
Got it. Perfect. Thank you for that confirmation. The last question before we leave, I know you're very busy. The last question I really wanted to ask you now that I have time with you here. There was a quote that Coach Sean McVay had said earlier last week, which basically kind of tiptoed around the idea that potentially you were hurt in the playoffs. And he said that Todd Gurley will not require surgery in this offseason. Now, why would a head coach say something of that sort? Why would you not require surgery unless you were hurt, right? So my only question is, are you denying the fact that potentially you were hurt and that you're going to be 100% this coming season in order to ensure that fantasy owners aren't going to draft a guy that potentially can get hurt in the first couple weeks and be out of a first-round pick? Because that's really what we're thinking.
In the wrong direction on a one-way street. They'll probably get 20 years for it. Gotcha. Parking next to a fire hydrant and no parking zone.
Understood.
In the wrong direction on a one-way street. They'll probably get 20 years for it. Sorry, dude, I saw it first.
Okay. Understood. Yeah. All right. Thank you, Todd. Again, it's your right to privacy. I'm not trying to, intrude and say that you are hurt. I'm not making claims. I'm just, I'm questioning. We have a great relationship, Todd. Anyway, I want to thank you again for taking your time out of your day, your busy schedule, to go ahead and talk to us and give us a little bit of information. So much appreciated, Todd. Until next time, get healthy and, make sure that C.J. Anderson, maybe if you can, you see him around the locker room, see him around the facility, make sure he stays off the treadmill. Make sure you take him out to eat and make sure he plumps up so you can get as many carries as you possibly can. He doesn't really, affect your fantasy stock. All right. All right. Take care, Todd. Thank you very much. Yeah, no problem. Anytime. All right. Have a nice day. Thank you. Goodbye. All right, ladies and gentlemen. Whew. That was it's quite the interview with Todd Gurley. I want to again thank him for taking the time out of his day to go ahead and join us and talk to us. So, in conclusion, where do we get to? Is Todd Gurley going to be the number one overall pick going into 2019 season? That's the big question. And to be honest, my answer to that really is I hope he's not. Right? And what I mean by that is I honestly hope that many other people in the fantasy community, whether they're playing with me, against me, doesn't matter, in other leagues, I hope Todd Gurley isn't the number one overall pick. Because if I'm sitting there and I'm sitting around the 1, 2, 3, 4 range of the draft, I'm in the top half of the draft, I'm picking within the first 4 picks, I'm thinking, Todd Gurley's going to come out. He's going to want to prove people wrong, right? They have a really salty taste in their mouth. Like he mentioned before, yes, they weren't able to achieve that goal, but they're ready to get back to work. And I think Todd Gurley, Sean McVay, this offense, they have a lot to prove going into this season. Yes, statistically, they've been great. They've been putting up a lot of stats. They've been making a lot of noise over the last 2 years. We've been talking about Todd Gurley, is he the MVP? Sean McVay, is he the new, big thing? This is why all these coaches are getting signed, these young coaches. Is that the new strategy? So as we get into this, I'm thinking the potential of Todd Gurley not being a number 1 overall pick and a lot of people skipping him, it's not a bad idea. And I think if guys like Saquon and Ezekiel Elliott were to go before him, and I'm sitting there at the number 3, number 4 spot, and Todd Gurley is still available, I'm thinking that's a steal. I'm thinking the best running back as of the last 2 seasons in fantasy football, the guy that's had the most red zone carries and the most red zone touches and touchdowns in the last 2 seasons. I'm thinking if I can get him with the number 3, number 4 overall pick, damn, that's a steal. So that's my conclusion. I think that if we can get to the point where Todd Gurley, if we can kind of get that idea going into people's minds, if we can start planting the seed that perhaps he isn't the number 1 overall pick and he can drop to us, shit, why not? Let's take him at number 4. Let's take him at number 3 because he's going to still be a stud. He's got a lot to prove. And this offense, they're young, they're hungry, and they're ready to get back to where they've been. And that's how I think this is going to end up. I think Todd Gurley potentially this coming season, yes, he may not be as highly touted as he was the year prior because of the playoff performance that he may have put up. But I think if he's healthy in 2019 and he's ready to get back to work, like he mentioned in our interview, I think Todd Gurley is a guy that, yes, he may not be the number 1 overall pick in many people's eyes, but goodness, I hope he's not. So when I'm sitting there at the number 3 or 4 spot, like I mentioned, I'm ready to draft him. Anyway, I want to thank everybody for watching. If you haven't already, please subscribe. If you have any comments, questions, hit me up down below. Chances are we're probably going to be putting out a video every week on different topics. So if you have any suggestions on topics, please let me know. Otherwise, thank you everybody for watching. And again, I'm back. It's 2019, and I'm ready to get to work. Just like Todd Gurley is getting ready to get to work to capture that Super Bowl, I'm ready to capture the YouTube Super Bowl. Thank you, everybody, and have a nice day.